Hello, Pontiac High School students! Today we're going to be looking at the different forms of government, or really how we define these different forms of government. So let's see what we got. First, we have to classify our governments. Governments are classified according to three different ideas. Number one, who can participate? That is, who gets to actually be a part of this government. Number two, where the government power is located. So this is the physical location. Is it centralized? Is it spread out? How does it work? And number three, the relationship between the executive and legislative branches. That is the relationship between those who carry out laws and those who write laws. We're going to look at each of these individually today, beginning with who can participate. The question of who can participate is probably the most important when we look at states. This is really going to show us where power is. Democracy is what we're most familiar with. In a democracy, the supreme authority rests with the citizens, the people. As Abraham Lincoln referred to our American government, he said we were a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And this is what we aspire to always be. Now, the US is the first modern example of a democratic state, a democracy, but we certainly are not the only democracies that the world has ever seen. Democracy is actually quite old. Now, in this, we have to understand that there are two different forms of democracy. There's direct democracy and indirect democracy. Both of these are used to a lesser degree today, but both were tried out a little bit more a couple of thousand years ago. Particularly in ancient Greece, they tried out a direct democracy where every citizen had a vote. The city-state of Athens, every citizen got to have a say on every issue. But you had to show up, which meant that if there was a vote in the middle of the day and you also had another job or you were out of town, you didn't actually have a say. And it became very difficult for Athens or anybody else who has tried this to manage a direct democracy. It really only works with small numbers of people. This is why we see that in the world today, no state uses this model. This is a capital S state instead of a lowercase s, because we were talking about those areas with sovereignty, territory, population, etc., formal states. But you do see it in some town hall meetings. There are towns throughout the United States, particularly in New England, where members of the town come, they sit down, they all have a vote, and that vote is binding. That vote becomes what the town does. But it is very uncommon across the rest of the United States and really only is effective in small towns. Indirect democracy is what we're more familiar with. This is where we vote for a representative who then pledges to vote according to our interests. So somebody says, I want to represent you in government, and then we can choose whether or not we want to vote for them based upon their beliefs. This system is more properly called a republic. So the United States is a republic, not a strict democracy, but we like the idea of democracy and rule by the people, and we've kind of adopted that word to what we do as well. Now, the opposite of the democracy is a dictatorship. In a dictatorship, the dictator is not accountable to the people, and in many cases, frankly, does not care what the people think. They will act in their own self-interest or what they believe the interests of the state are. They have absolute authority. They can do whatever they want. Now, in the modern world, we only see a few true outright dictatorships. North Korea is one. This is Kim Jong-un. He is the leader of North Korea and is an absolute dictator, doesn't hide it at all. But other dictators like to disguise themselves as being a one-party democracy, a government in which one political party exists and holds power. And when you go to vote on election day, there are candidates that you can cast your vote for, but there's only one political party. And all those candidates have been chosen by the political party, which in many cases, most cases, is directed by the head of that political party, who's really just a dictator. We see this in a lot of nations, particularly some East African nations. Robert Mugabe is a strong example of this in East Africa. We also can probably rightfully say that Russia under Vladimir Putin is veered away from democracy enough that it would be a one-party democracy dictatorship that has formed in Russia these days. Now, dictatorships and other names, we don't always think of the word dictator this way, but a monarchy is a type of dictatorship. A monarch has absolute rule. Their rule is just inherited, and many will claim divine right to that rule. But they do have a system where one person holds power. It's not shared amongst others in the state, and therefore monarchies are dictatorships. Additionally, we have oligarchies. Oligarchies are government where a group of people, small group of people, hold power rather than a single dictator or ruling family. You could argue that the way China runs their system within the higher levels of the Communist Party in China are kind of an oligarchy dictatorship that exists within that state as well. All right, so that was who holds power. Now let's look at geographic distribution. Now, each state decides if they are going to hold all of the powers of government in a single location or spread the authority of government across the state. The size of the state is often a big factor in this decision, but is not necessarily the case. Let's look first at centralized power. Unitary government has the most centralized power. All the main powers of government are held in a single location by a single agency. Within the UK, the United Kingdom, England, Great Britain, it's all one. This government there, their parliament, is a unitary government. They hold all the power. And all regional powers are created by parliament, and parliament can have direct say over what they do. So they might let a regional authority kind of run their own stuff until they don't like what they're doing, and then they'll give them a directive. And that regional government has to act. This government can choose to change the regional authorities whenever they want, because all of the power is with the central authority. Again, that's how the United Kingdom does it. A federal government is where you share the power between federal and regional, local governments. This is how the United States does it. We have a central government. We have the government in Washington, D.C., but we also have 50 state governments. Michigan has its government in Lansing. These are two different governments that have two different levels of authority. Lansing does not have to do what Washington, D.C. tells them to do, not on a large number of issues. This is a federal system of government. The central government in these systems cannot take power away from a state, and in many cases cannot overrule the state. The other end of this extreme is a Confederate government. In a Confederate government, we have the regional authorities telling a central authority what to do. Whereas we had shared power here the regional authorities are actually more powerful than the central government. These states form a government that has the power that the states agree to give it, usually for mutual defense or economic union, but this leads to a weak central government. They are only allowed to do what the regional governments, in this case the states, would agree to allow them to do. The United States tried this. This was the Articles of Confederation, and it failed pretty miserably. We were not mutually defensive, and our economy was very disunited. It didn't work out very well for us at all. A more modern example of this is what the European Union is trying to do, and they're also having a lot of troubles with this. At any point, a state may withdraw from the Confederation. This has been a problem in the past. It's a problem today. The United Kingdom withdrew from the European Union, and that is causing all types of trouble in Europe. All right, the final of the three, the relationship between executive and legislative branches. This can tell us whether or not we have a presidential or parliamentary government. So what is presidential government? What is parliamentary government? Well, in a presidential government, the chief executive is chosen independently of the legislature. This allows the president to act independently of the legislature, but it also kind of creates conflicts between the two branches. We could as we did in the United States for a long time. We had a Democrat, President Obama, and then we had a Republican Congress. The two disagreed so much that they were not able to get much done. This happens in presidential systems because the president is chosen by the people, not by the legislature, in our case, not by Congress. Whereas in a parliamentary system, we have a legislature electing the chief executive. So in the United States, that would be like if Congress chose the president and we did not have a say in who the president was. In most of these parliamentary systems, they don't call it a president, they call it a prime minister. The prime minister is then going to work with the legislature on lots of issues, and they're going to mostly agree on most things. If at any point the legislature doesn't like the prime minister or what the prime minister is doing, they can replace the prime minister. That's true within a parliamentary system. So to give you a little bit of a visual here, we have our voters in both systems. In our presidential system, the voters elect the legislature, the voters elect the chief executive. They have a say on both sides. But here in a parliamentary system, the voters elect the legislative branch, and then the legislative branch chooses the chief executive. The voters do not have a say in the chief executive. Great Britain does it this way. A number of countries, particularly in Europe, run their system in this way. All right, so that was the different forms of government and 3 basics for classifying them. I hope that you learned something today, and farewell.